There is a story many of us were taught, a small story, a narrow one, that slavery was an American problem, that it happened here and mostly here alone, that the pain, the responsibility, and the reckoning belong to one nation. But history tells a different story, a wider story, a heavier one. Today's episode exists because slavery was global. Africans were enslaved across continents, across empires, across centuries. And until we tell the whole truth, we will continue to misunderstand who we are. This conversation is not about blame, it's about clarity. Because when you realize how many nations enslaved Africans, how much of the world was built on African labor, and how deeply African culture shaped global society, you begin to understand why denying Africa makes no sense. Africans were not enslaved in one place. They were enslaved wherever power wanted profit. Europe, the Caribbean, Latin America, North America, the Middle East, parts of Asia. Entire economies were built on African bodies. Portugal, Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium. These nations financed, organized, and protected the trade of African lives. Brazil alone received more Africans than the United States ever did. Caribbean nations ran either plantation economics or enslaved Africans. The Middle East trafficked Africans for over 1,000 years. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't isolated. This was global demand. And when people say slavery was an American thing, they are repeating an incomplete history. Here's the truth that transcends time. The cheaper the labor, the easier it is to abuse the worker. And that was true during slavery, and it is true today when people are seen as replaceable, desperate, unprotected, or disposable. Their humanity becomes negotiable. During slavery, Africans were labeled property. Today, immigrants are often labeled illegal. Different words, same logic. Long hours, low wages, dangerous conditions, little protection. The system doesn't disappear, it evolves. And when we don't recognize the patterns, we normalize the harm. Africa was not enslaved because it lacked value. Africa was targeted because it had value. The continent holds gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, copper, uranium, fertile land, ancient trade routes, knowledge of systems older than Europe. Modern technology depends on resources extracted from African soil. European wealth did not appear out of nowhere. Gold did not walk itself into vaults. Diamonds did not extract themselves. Oil did not claim itself. Africa was drained, then blamed. You cannot steal from a land for centuries and then call it poor. To enslave people at scale, a lie had to be invented that Africans were less human, not because it was true, but because it was useful. Religion was twisted, science was falsified, history was rewritten, inferiority became a justification. Because if Africans were fully recognized as humans, enslavement would be indefensible, theft would be obvious, abuse would demand accountability. So the lie had to be constant and loud. There is another truth we must speak. The people who were enslaved did not arrive empty handed. They came with a plethora of talent, They brought agricultural knowledge that transformed farming systems, rhythms that became blues, jazz, gospel, samba, reggae, and hip hop, craftsmanship that advanced tools and infrastructure, spiritual practices that were absorbed, renamed, and repackaged, storytelling traditions, and language patterns that shaped cultures. African culture did not disappear in bondage, it was absorbed, and often it was stolen without credit. Food, music, dance, religion, fashion, language. The world enjoyed the fruit while denying the tree. Many nations built cultural identities using African brilliance while denying Africans their humanity. The labor was stolen, the land was stolen, and even the genius was stolen. Absence from the record does not mean absence from history. It means the record was incomplete by design. Many people say, I'm not African. That denial didn't come from truth, it came from trauma. Our ancestors were stripped of names, punished for language, forbidden to practice culture, torn from lineage, disconnected from enforcement. And over time, survival became silence. But slavery was not an origin story, it was an interpretation. Africa did not disappear, it was obscured. And obscured things can be reclaimed. Here is the truth that reframes everything. If Africa was enslaved across the world, then Africa sits at the center of global history, not the margins. The modern world did not develop despite Africa, it developed because of Africa. Once you see that, then denial becomes illogical. You don't exploit what has no value, you exploit what is essential. This episode is not about guilt, it's about truth alignment. Because once you understand how many African, how many enslaved African nations, how much wealth came from African labor, how deeply African culture shaped the world, not only did it shape the world, but just think, each one of us has some African blood in us. So when we want to say we're 100% of one nationality, think twice, because Africa was in the mix. You stop asking, why were we looked down on? You start asking, why were they so dependent upon us? Africa was not forgotten because it's insignificant. Africa was forgotten because remember it would expose too much, like I mentioned, your ancestry. This is the unexpected detour, where we face the turns history didn't warn us about and reclaim the parts of ourselves that were buried, not lost, because our history did not begin in chains. It began long before them.